Welcome to Knock Talk. I'm your host, Wil'liam Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with a very hot microphone I just turned down. Broadcasting for you, episode number 22, Matthew chapter 19. Keeping the commandments. Is that really what Jesus commanded? We're going to find out. There's a lot more to go over. And so coming to you from beloved Canada with our beloved Rabbi Michael Skobac. I didn't have to add that in there, but I did anyway. Rabbi, how are you, sir?
Baruch Hashem, thank God. It's so good to be here with you.
Oh, this is cool. I just realized I forgot to change my hat. Yes, I have different hats for different features, different things. And ironically, Rabbi, you won't see this, but everybody else will. This is like my favorite hat because it has lights on it. And I actually made a customer nervous one time. I think that person might have thought it was a video camera or something.
Maybe they thought you were an alien.
Ooh. Yep. So there you go. There you have it, folks. There's my work hat right there. I probably ought to get that thing. That thing looks nasty. Hang on a second. Rabbi, how was your week? I know you have, as usual, are very busy. And I know it's been a very busy week for me, too. Oh, I got to tell you something, Rabbi. Yesterday... Yeah, y'all are only going to like this one. Yesterday, I fell in the lake.
You know what? It's been like 95 degrees here, so that must have been pleasant.
Actually, it was. It was pretty cool, except for I had my phone on my hip, and it's an expensive, the Galaxy, Samsung Galaxy Note 4. It's like the new latest and greatest. And so basically gave it a baptism yesterday, and my headphones went with it, and I was under, it was submerged in the water for very well over, 45 seconds to a minute before I actually got it up and, pulled the case off of it to lay it out and let it dry out.
No, you're supposed to baptize it in rice. That's what you're supposed to do.
That's what I followed it up with. Yeah. And actually it was resurrected. Okay. It's working fine now. Oh man. But anyway, more to that story, but that's not what this episode is about. So, Rabbi, thank you for coming.
Okay, so wow, we're coming, to the last third of the book of Matthew. It looks like
we are getting there. And as I was scanning over the chapter, I thought it was cool, and I know you're going to cover this, where he says, which is kind of the title of this broadcast. Jesus says, he said, "What must I do?" He said, "Keep the commandments." So he's telling this, but then I'm seeing things in here where it looks like he's leading them away from the commandments. I don't know. And I'm sure you'll offer some clarity to that. So
maybe
we'll find out. Okay. Well, I guess we should get this thing kicked off since I took up the first 5 minutes.
So, I'm going to probably sound like a broken record tonight, but I have two reasons for doing this. Number one, it could be that someone's listening for the first time. Mm-hmm. And secondly, the Talmud actually teaches that, someone who learns something 101 times, is not the same as someone who's learned it 100 times. So it doesn't hurt to repeat certain things, especially when it's actually going to be coming up in the text over and over again. It's not my fault; it's Matthew's fault.
Right.
But the chapter begins by telling us that, these great multitudes follow Jesus, and he healed them there. This has been coming up repeatedly throughout the book of Matthew so far. It's going to come up in Luke, especially in Luke. Many references to the fact that wherever he goes, Jesus has these huge crowds following him, and he has to basically keep on trying to get one step ahead of them. He's being pressed and he's being squeezed. There's so many people. And the Gospels tell us that his fame spread throughout all of not just the area in the Galilee, but throughout, the neighboring countries. So, it's just important to bear this in mind, because one of the central polemical passages in the Tanakh is the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, the suffering servant. But Isaiah tells us that the suffering servant will be universally despised and rejected, meaning a totally unpopular being. And we know for sure that the Jewish people, we certainly have that status nailed down pretty clearly, because we have a history of over 3,000 years, and pretty much over that entire period of time, and regardless of where we exist in the world, it could be in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, people don't like Jews. And not just don't like Jews, but there's tremendous persecution and hatred of Jews even in countries where there are no Jews. In the Far East today, there are countries where there are no Jews, but their best-selling books are books proving that Jews are trying to control the world. So, to say that the Jewish people have been unpopular and rejected throughout our history is pretty much true. But to take Jesus, where the Gospels repeatedly tell us how incredibly popular he was while he was alive, and of course we know that after his death, he slowly became the superstar, the most popular person in history. So it's very hard to line up these stories in the Gospels of Jesus' immense popularity with what Isaiah speaks about in terms of the suffering servant being despised and rejected and incredibly unpopular. So I think it's important to point that out because it comes up all the time. Now in verse 3, we've also seen this in the past. It's sort of a strange way of framing things where it's the Pharisees who come to test Jesus. And again, it's like saying, the Republicans came, to question Donald Trump. What do you mean the Republicans? There are millions of them. So, I mean, if I had my red editing pen, I would say some Pharisees rather than saying the Pharisees. It's just
Right.
peculiar. And I think part of this is, it's like when the Gospel of John will speak about the Jews, the Jews. So it's sort of, by speaking about the Pharisees, it makes them sound like some entity, like, there's this a discrete group of this cabal of these nasty, Pharisees that, just constantly following Jesus around. So the crux of this chapter is interesting that, they're asking him about divorce. They probably heard about some of his views regarding divorce. And they ask him straight out, is it okay, is it lawful for a person to divorce his wife for any reason? And they probably had heard his views. And in the next verses, Jesus sort of proves how Jewish he is by answering their question with a question. It's very typical Jewish style to never, directly give a straight answer. You just answer with a question. So he does the same thing. And we've seen this actually come up several times before where he responds by asking a question. And he says, look, didn't you read that when God made Adam and Eve in the beginning, he made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. And so he makes the argument, therefore, Jesus says, that what God has joined together, let not man separate, let no man cast asunder. So he takes the Genesis story and says that, you see, since the Bible tells us that the husband and wife become one flesh, his assumption or his conclusion is that's how they have to remain. They have to remain one flesh. And so basically he takes the view that, he really seems to take the view that would say divorce is never allowed. That seems to be his preferred point of view. We'll see he modifies that. But he takes a hard-line view, and basically will say that except for cases of adultery, fornication, any kind of sexual immorality, divorce would not be allowed. It's not allowed for any reason. Mm-hmm. So he takes a view, and by the way, this is the view of the school of Shammai. In the Talmud, there's a very serious and famous debate between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. So the school of Hillel says that, look, if a man just grows not to love his wife and he finds that she's no longer appealing to him, he can divorce her for that. He doesn't have to live with her if there's no love at all and they're not getting along. Shammai seems to say no, they really can't be divorced until there's some sexual indiscretion. And Jesus seems to take that view as well. So he would have, I guess, within the Jewish tradition, some hook to hang his position on. But we'll see that it goes a little bit further. Now, his reasoning is, again, based upon this verse in Genesis, that what God has put together, let no man cast asunder, let no man separate. This is actually an idea that we do find in Jewish tradition and Jewish teaching in the Midrash and the Talmud, that matches are made in heaven. There's a famous story where a Roman matron came to Rabbi Yossi Bar Halafta, and she asked him, look, we know that God created the world, but she said, but what is God doing since he created the world? Like, they often ask rabbis this question, what does a rabbi do all week? They see him on Shabbat. What does a rabbi do all week? So she asked the same question, so fine, God created the world, but now what is he doing? So Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta said he arranges marriages. And she sort of chuckled and she said, "What? Anyone could do that. What do you have to have God doing that for?" So she took 1,000 slaves, 500 male and 500 female slaves, and she sort of quickly paired them up. And this one go with that one, and that one will go with that one. And then the story goes on that the next morning they came walking in. This one had an eye poked out, and this one's arm was in a sling, and this one was all battered. So she saw that she didn't do quite well, and that it's not that easy to match people up and to find appropriate matches for people. But there is this idea that, we speak about it in Hebrew, bashert, someone sort of divinely intended. It's true. There is this concept in Judaism, but it doesn't guarantee that the people who were put together by God, that the relationship will work out. There can be many things that go wrong down the road. So it could be that they should have been for each other, but sometimes things don't work out. Now, Jesus seems to build his argument because the verse says they'll become one flesh. And he seems to take it as, the two actually become one together, and then you can't break that one apart. Rashi, the famous biblical commentary who lived 1,000 years ago in France, Rashi says they become one flesh in their children they produce. And so that would sort of take the edge off of Jesus's argument that, you can have a couple and they become a unit, and they actually will produce children that is the one flesh that the scripture is referring to. And that would not that would not imply that these two should necessarily be forced together to, live together endlessly if the relationship's not working out. It's interesting that the Talmud actually says that the altar in the temple sheds tears when a person divorces his first wife. It's tragic. It's not something which we ever celebrate. We certainly don't take divorce lightly, but it would seem to be incredibly cruel to force a couple to live together if they can't stand each other and if they're not getting along. But certainly, matches are made in heaven. Divorces are tragic, but it seems that to forbid divorce would be a worse option.
Sure.
Now, where it becomes very difficult to square Jesus' teachings with Judaism at all is that he says that the permission to give divorce was only because of the hardness of our hearts. So he seems to be saying that, look, ideally, the way God intended things is that couples stay together forever. And he says that it was Moses who who allowed us to divorce because of the hardness of our hearts. Now, that really, it clashes with, the ears of anyone who's read the Tanakh, because it never says that in the Tanakh, meaning that the laws that we find in the book of Deuteronomy are not presented as something, that was not really ever intended. It seems to be just presented as a law without any strings attached, meaning that the Bible seems to assume at the outset that there will be times, there will be situations where divorce will basically be required, either for unfaithfulness or for other strong reasons. There could be, other reasons why a couple can no longer live together. And so when the Torah presents the laws of divorce and how divorce takes place, it never really presents it as something which, is a concession to our wickedness, a concession to our hard hearts. That's just something that is not found in the Jewish scriptures. Now, it's not easy to understand what Jesus might have meant by this when he says, Moses, because of the hardness, this is in verse 8, because of the hardness of your hearts, Now, I'm not sure if that eliminates, how Noahide law would operate. This is already a discussion which I can't get into because, is Jesus here speaking about the Torah and Jewish law, or would this be something which goes beyond Jewish law to human law in general, maybe even including Noahide law, that divorce shouldn't have been allowed, but it was permitted because of the hardness of our hearts? The way Jesus presents it is that Moses allowed it because of the hardness of your hearts, meaning he seems to be speaking specifically to the Jews. And what might this mean? So I think that one way of reading this is that possibly, again, I'm speculating here, that until this time, divorce would never have been allowed in God's eyes, meaning that until the time that Moses, put together the book of Deuteronomy, where you find the laws of divorce, it could be that Jesus was implying that from God's point of view, divorce would never be allowed. And then Jesus seems to imply that Moses himself allowed for divorce because of the hardness of people's hearts. And I'm not quite sure if Jesus is implying that Moses came up with this innovation on his own, meaning it would be very radical for Jesus to be saying that this law in Deuteronomy was not God's will, but it was something that Moses made up on his own. You could certainly read his words like that, meaning that he seems to be saying that God, from his perspective, would not allow divorce, but Moses, possibly Jesus is saying, came up with this innovation in the law, this permission, basically because people's hearts were hard. That might be one way of reading Jesus, and I think it's very, very problematic because in Jewish thought, we don't have Moses as the lawmaker; he's the lawgiver, and God is the lawmaker.
That's a good point.
But I think another way of reading this passage, possibly, is that God himself would have preferred no divorce, but it was God himself, meaning there's no implication here that this is Moses' radical idea, but that God himself realized it wouldn't be realistic, meaning that, again, at that point, though, it's hard to understand why Jesus would say it was Moses who wrote this because of your hardness of your hearts. But I think that what it may be saying is that, God told Moses to write this because of just confronting the reality of human existence, meaning that because God understood that people may come to situations where they'll despise each other, there'll be other reasons why a couple just can't live together. It'd be cruel to force a couple to stay together if they're fighting every single day. Even though the Talmud says the altar in the temple sheds tears when a man divorces his first wife. So the attitude is, yeah, sure, it's better for the altar to shed tears once than for the couple, to be shedding tears for their entire lives. So it could be that that's the perspective that Jesus has here, that it's basically bowing. God really is bowing to the realities of life, and that people, their hearts aren't always perfect. And we see that there may be parallels to this in the Bible. I'll give you a few examples. It's clear that, from a Jewish perspective, polygamy is not a great thing. I mean, every single story in the Bible where a man marries more than one woman, it's a disaster in the house. It never works out.
Right.
And but we see in the Bible, though, that God permits polygamy. So even though it's clear that it's an obnoxious institution, it's not healthy, it never works out. The word in Hebrew for the co-wife is tsara, which means suffering or trouble or suffering. So there are people who proposed, who suggested that, look, God, in revealing the Torah to us, has to deal with people where they are. It says in Proverbs, teach a child, where he's at. You have to deal with people from the situation that they're in. And so there are people who suggested this, that, when the Torah was given, it just would have been absurd to tell people that you can't have more than one wife, because number one, that was what the whole world was doing. It's not possible to sometimes legislate complete changes in morality. Sometimes people have to be educated and led in that direction. So there are those who suggest that polygamy was tolerated, although far from the ideal, and that God was hoping or assuming that one day people would come to the realization themselves that this is not an institution that should be tolerated. And that's what happened in Jewish history. The rabbis themselves came to the position that we should just ban polygamy. Another example would be slavery. It's clear that slavery is not a positive institution. And yet the Bible seems to tolerate it, in the sense that we see in the book of Exodus, actually the first laws right after the Ten Commandments are given are the laws of how to treat slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is, and this applies to many things in the Torah, that the laws try to take an institution which is not ideal, which is far from the ideal, but realizing that you just can't legislate things away necessarily. You just can't step into a world in which certain things have been so ingrained and just wipe it away with the stroke of a pen. So what the Torah law does, and we find this especially in the oral law, is that it takes the institution of slavery and circumscribes it in a way where it's far less intolerable, meaning there are very strict laws about how to treat slaves. For example, the Talmud goes to the extent of saying that if you had slaves, but you had 2 pillows in the house, you had to give 1 pillow to the slave. You couldn't keep 1 for yourself. But if you only had 1 pillow, the slave had to get it. You couldn't give slaves meaningless things to do. You couldn't just beat them. There were many, many rules that took an institution which is really far from ideal and tried to modify it, or at least circumscribe it in a way where it would be far less intolerable. But hopefully with all these laws, people realizing, you know what, slavery is just not cool and we shouldn't have slaves. And so at some point in Jewish history, slavery ceased on its own. A third example might be what you find in Deuteronomy chapter 21 of the Yafat Toar. The Yafat Toar, the woman who's captured during a war. Here you have men in the heat of battle, and they find a beautiful woman that's captured in the middle of a war. What do? So most armies would just rape women left and right. So the Torah had an institution where the man had to basically take her and make her less attractive and wait a month, and then he was able to have relations with her. But the Torah seemed to be at least realizing you can't tell men in the heat of battle you can't have any contact with these women at all. So the Torah has this track record of dealing with people where they're at, and it could be that that's the theory that Jesus has here. Ideally there should be no divorce, but given the world that we live in, people do have relationships that break down. So God, because people's hearts can be hard, allow divorce. And maybe, the concept Jesus is saying is that one day maybe people would reach the level where they would just ban it on their own. But I don't think that's really going to happen so quickly. Let me just end this chapter, this piece of it, by pointing out the one part of Jesus' teachings here that are the most difficult to square with Jewish law. I mean, the part about grounds for divorce, you can make an argument, but it seems that Jesus is teaching here, and we saw this earlier in Matthew, that if you marry a woman that's divorced, you're committing adultery. This is a difficult passage because there are some manuscripts here in Matthew 19 that don't have that exactly, but other manuscripts do. And I think earlier in Matthew, I think it was chapter 5, it clearly taught that. And, that's going way beyond anything that was ever taught in Jewish law. Beit Shammai, the school of Shammai, took a strict line on when divorce is allowed, but it would be a draconian ruling to say that people who are divorced cannot remarry. But I know that there are Christians who don't remarry. I know some personally that after the divorces did not remarry, specifically because of these passages in Matthew. Judaism would say this is just simply cruel and unusual treatment of people, to force people who've gotten divorced into a life of just being single forever. It's impossible to square these teachings, at least, with Judaism. Ready to go on?
Yes, sir. That sounds good.
Well, yeah.
You're making me think about this particular scenario and how it maybe there was something contextually missing in a little bit whenever when he talks about not, some aren't married, some, are eunuchs and such. It makes me wonder. Now, of course, I'm not saying just the eunuchs, but I mean, as far as not being married, and I'm right on the surface, I'm thinking, wait, if they don't get married, then how can they have children? If they're not having children, then they're violating, the chronologically first commandment ever given, so is he teaching that you don't have to get married and have children, or is he
that's the next piece here, meaning that the piece we just finished ended by, him essentially claiming that you cannot remarry after divorce. Or even someone marrying for the first time, he cannot marry someone who is divorced.
So are you saying that maybe what he's saying, he's specifically contextually talking to those people, not to every man, but just the ones who have been married and who have divorced, and he's now talking to those about remarriage? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, it's not clear to me, but it seems that he says that, if you marry someone who was divorced, you're committing adultery. So, that would apply to either a man himself who's been divorced and he is thinking of marrying a woman who had been divorced, or it would seem to be even a man who's single and never married before, but he would not be able to marry a divorced woman. But it seems to be putting, people that have been divorced, into this situation where they can never remarry. And that's why the students at the end here, they sort of freak out and they say, wow, if that's the case, of a man with his wife, it's better never to marry. Meaning they seem to be saying that if you get married, which is strange for them to say that, because, if you never get married, then you certainly have the problem. If you get married, then you may never get divorced and you're in the blue. But, he says in the next piece here, starting in verse 11, obviously he says everyone can't accept this teaching, only those to whom it's been given. Meaning he seems to acknowledge that this would be a very difficult law to follow, that people who are divorced can never remarry. And then he goes on to say, there are eunuchs who were born this way, meaning there are people who just physically from birth, can't have children. And he says there were eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, meaning there are people who've been castrated by others. And he says there are eunuchs who've made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Now, some people have taken this to mean that people should actually castrate themselves. I think I mentioned last week, right. He said in a previous chapter, if your eye offends you, cut it out. There are many historians who believe that Eusebius, Origen in the 2nd century, that he castrated himself because of these verses. I think that if I was trying to understand what Jesus is saying, I don't think he's saying that you actually make yourself physically into a eunuch. I think he's speaking about just people who don't marry. They live a celibate life. And he seems to be saying that is actually an ideal. He seems to be saying that not everyone can accept this, but he speaks about this, and he seems to be speaking about it in a positive way, meaning you're doing it for the kingdom of heaven's sake. That seems to be noble. And then he says, and he who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Now, we know, at least, unless you read the Da Vinci Code, that Jesus himself never married. We know that Paul never married. It seems that John the Baptizer never married. So we seem to see that in the early days of the Christian movement, living a monastic life seemed to have been held up as an ideal. We know that, for many centuries, the Catholic Church, their priests have been celibate. As you said, this seems to very much go against the grain of the Bible's first commandment, Genesis 1:25, of pru urvu, of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the Talmud actually tells us, it's interesting, the Talmud tells us that, at the end of our lives, when we go upstairs, each of us will be given a final exam. And the Talmud is very nice in that it sort of lets us see the questions before we get up there. So the first question that will be asked according to the Talmud is, did you deal honestly and fairly in your business practices? But one of the other questions is, asakta b'pirya v'rivya, did you engage in trying to procreate? Right? Did you try to have children? It doesn't. You're not going to be asked, did you have children, because that's not in your control. But the Talmud says that your question you'll be asked is, did you try to, which would imply that you did get married. In Jewish teaching, marriage is clearly an ideal, even when there are no children. We know from the stories in Genesis that, Jacob was angry with Rachel because, she wasn't able to have children and she felt, she was useless. And he was saying, no, there's a value to having a loving spousal relationship, even in the absence of children. And why are you demeaning yourself? So the Talmud says that a person without a spouse is like a half a person. You're not a full person. And it's interesting that this is the very verse that Jesus himself quoted before. Jesus quoted the directive, therefore, every man shall leave his father and mother, and they shall cleave to their wife and become one flesh. So, he's sort of taking a stance here, which sort of contradicts his earlier appeal to that verse in Genesis, where people were given the mandate to leave their family, leave their parents' household, and set up their own households, get married and have their own families. So this is a very, very strange teaching. We have two already in Matthew 19. One is his prohibition against remarriage after divorce, and secondly, it seems that there's at least some gentle advocacy here of celibacy, but in the Torah, this is certainly not acceptable. We actually had one rabbi in the entire Talmud, Ben Azai, we're told, because of his great, great, great love for the Torah, he couldn't see himself loving anyone else. So he never got married. He remained a bachelor.
Now, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility that, how the New Testament, it kind of paints the picture of, everybody that we're being a kingdom of priests. Now, in the priesthood, they're not allowed to marry someone who was divorced or someone who was not a virgin, right?
Only the high priest had to marry a virgin. Other priests could.
Interesting. But could the other priest remarry or marry a divorced woman as a regular priest?
A priest who divorced could marry someone, but she couldn't be divorced.
Okay, so maybe that's what he was alluding to. Maybe that's the conception of the New Testament idea about you're all a kingdom of priests, so therefore you have to follow the rules of the priest, meaning you can't marry a divorced woman. Is that a possibility, you think?
It may be, but the problem is that he seems to be including women in that. For example, a woman, right, that was divorced, or you're saying that she also sort of achieves the status of being a priest.
Yeah, because
it's sort of stretching things, because the Bible's prohibition was only on the males. So you'd have to really sort of stretch the idea of priesthood.
Well, stretching the idea in the New Testament would be pretty easy, because, it goes on to say, there's no male nor female, no Jew nor Greek.
Yes.
And so they're really trying to paint everybody as an equal. And so with that whole overview, it could be possible. I'm not really sure.
You know what? It's a good theory in terms of how this ethic of remaining single.
Sure.
Although the priests were not really supposed to be. Matter of fact, it's interesting. The high priest, in order to serve on the Day of Atonement, had to be married, and they had lined up like a vice priest. Nice. They had someone standing in the wings. The priest had to be married and couldn't serve in the temple. Otherwise, couldn't serve in his duties of a high priest. So it's really an interesting parallel to make, in that the Bible itself speaks about all the Jewish people as a holy nation and kingdom of priests, but it would never suggest that this restriction that was only placed upon the actual Aaron priest, the priest descending from Aaron, should ever be seen as an ideal that all people should abide by. But you could be, suggesting something that makes some sense here, that that might have been Jesus's model, but it's certainly not the model of Judaism.
Sure.
And by the way, it was also the ideal of the Essenes. Many or
Mm-hmm.
most of the Essenes remained celibate and didn't marry. Might be one of the reasons we don't have many Essenes around anymore. But that was a sectarian group that was around at the time of the first century. But it certainly was seen as an aberration. The same I mentioned Ben Azai, he was not seen as a noble, great man and not getting married. It was seen as a bit strange and as an aberration. And again, there is the first commandment in the Bible, so it's hard for a person to, be really, really, truly virtuous and righteous if they're skipping that very first commandment. Which brings us to the famous story of the rich young ruler. It's interesting that in Matthew, he's not really called a ruler. He seems to be rich because we'll see that he doesn't want to give away all his money, so he must have money to be worried about. But I think in Luke, it does speak about him as a ruler. So this is a very, very important story. It's a famous story where this fellow comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?" So he wants all the, he wants to win the jackpot here. He wants to make sure he's going to be living forever in eternity in we call Olam Haba, the world to come. And Jesus says to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, and that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." We do refer to God in the Jewish liturgy as good. For example, when really wonderful things happen in life, we hear good news. For example, you make a blessing, Baruch Hatov v'Hametiv. Blessed is the good, he who is good, and who Hametiv, and who does good. We refer to God as the good. So God, Jesus says to this young man, look, first of all, let's get one thing clear. He says, don't call me good, only God is good. And if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments.
Now, how do you blend that with I and the Father are one? And Adonai
You'd have a hard
Echad.
time. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we've mentioned in the past here a number of times, is that in Matthew so far, we've seen that there are mixed messages about who Jesus was. We've seen some passages where it certainly seems to paint a very elevated understanding of who Jesus either claimed to be or was seen as. And we've seen other passages where it's pretty clear that he's not, seen as divine. This seems to be an unambiguous statement that Jesus is clearly not claiming to be God. He seems to very clearly and adamantly, make a distinction between himself and God. So I would be inclined to basically, if I had to, at least in the synoptic gospels, John might be different, but at least in the synoptics, my understanding is that Jesus never really claimed to be God, and he was never understood to be God. And then the question is, what do you do with those ambiguous comments, those ambiguous statements where he seems to be held up as much more than a human being? So I would really understand those passages as basically saying that he's not God, but he is an intermediary to God. He's the way in which people can come to God. But that's certainly distinct from being God himself. And what we know happened in Christian theology is that in no uncertain terms, Jesus became seen as God in the flesh through the incarnation. Jesus is actually is one with God, and actually God himself. And Jesus is seen in the gospel, in the writings of Paul, as a creator of the world. It's pretty clear what ultimately happened in Christian history, and I think it's significant that Jesus says two things here that really became pivotal in the history of Christianity. He says here, number one, I'm not God. Don't even call me good. And then he says, look, if you want to know what the ultimate thing you can do is, if you want to do the perfect thing for yourself, keep the commandments. We know that both of these things were dramatically changed into the 2nd century. We know that by the 2nd century, anyone that called himself a follower of Jesus saw Jesus as God. And that unfortunately became the conventional thinking in Christianity for the last 1900 years. Unless you're considered a heretical group like Unitarians today, or let's say the Jehovah's Witnesses who don't see Jesus as God, but virtually all Christians, their doctrinal statements see Jesus as God, part of the Trinity, God in the flesh. That was, I think, a radical departure from the first century. And the second thing that happened in Christian history was, again, by the second century, basically anyone other than people considered heretics from the church, but anyone who saw themselves as a follower of Jesus was not following the commandments. Even though that's what Jesus says here, the commandments became almost a dirty word in the early history of the church. And we know that those Jewish followers of Jesus, the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, who did stay loyal to observing the Torah, they were persecuted by the Gentile church. So we know that it didn't take long, to find that Christians, had no affinity to observing the Torah. It was really seen as something that was quite negative. And it's interesting that in the modern days, in our times, when the Messianic Jewish movement started in the late 60s, early 70s, one of the main criticisms from the church world was, you're going back to the law. I remember reading articles in Charisma Magazine and Christianity Today where the Messianic movement was accused of going back to the law. That's how far things had strayed from this passage in Matthew 19. What to me is amazing is that I believe Christianity may be beginning to turn around. The ship, I think, is beginning to turn, because over the past 5 years, I'm getting at least one or two messages, phone calls, emails, Facebook messages, being contacted now regularly by people struggling, people who've been raised and have been Christians for decades, struggling with these two very issues. Number one, they tell me, I cannot accept the idea that Jesus was God. They just are tormented by this belief that's been forced on them to see Jesus as God. And the second thing that they are disturbed by is that because they're so interested in reading and understanding the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, they see that in the Tanakh, the Torah and its commandments are the centerpiece, are the most important thing. They see what an incredibly important part the commandments play in our relationship with God, and they see that's exactly what Jesus taught. And they're disturbed by the fact that the Christianity that they're part of basically takes these two principal concepts and turns them on their head. So this, to me, is a very, very important passage in the New Testament, because it's almost so antithetical to what became of Christianity. In just one sentence, where Jesus basically says, I'm not God, and you know what you need to focus on? Keeping the commandments. So this is actually one of several places. It's not the only place. One of a number of places in the Gospels where Jesus very unabashedly advocates the importance of Torah observant. And what's important here is not so much what Jesus says, but what he doesn't say. Right? When the man asks him, what do I need to do to achieve eternal life? He doesn't say what Paul would have said, which is, you have to have faith in the Messiah. Mm-hmm. You have to believe that, that the Messiah died for your sins. You have to, have the proper doctrinal stance. He doesn't say anything that Paul would have said. He focuses on the importance of observing the commandments. And he doesn't even hint at what Paul would say, which is that you can't keep the commandments. They're impossible to keep. They're beyond you. It's not possible to keep the law. That sort of that routine that we constantly hear. I mean, I constantly hear this from Christians who throw it in my face. You can't keep the law. What are you trying for? What are you trying to do? You're trying to fool yourself. So Jesus does not even hint at this idea that it's impossible to observe the commandments. He insists that the young man do that. Now, I think some Christians will point out that in this list of commandments that Jesus gives here, because the young man wants to know which commandments you're talking about, Jesus says, do not murder, do not commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, you love your neighbor as yourself. So some Christians will point out that it's interesting, they would say, that Jesus only focused here on commandments dealing with a relationship between human beings. And he doesn't mention any of the ritual commandments. He doesn't mention what we call in Hebrew the mitzvot ben adam lemakom, the commandments that deal with our relationship with God, like keeping kosher and the Sabbath, wearing tzitzit, all of the what Christians often refer to as the ceremonial laws or the ritual laws. And so they may take this passage in Matthew here as fuel for their point of view, which says, yeah, all those laws have been done away with. They say, we believe that we have to treat each other properly. We don't disagree with the Old Testament laws that advocate proper human relationships. But I think they would say those laws that were distinctly ceremonial, ritual laws, for the Jewish people specifically, we no longer follow those. I think that's a difficult thing to say, because we even have stories in the Talmud where great rabbis were approached by people trying to find out, what is the essence of Judaism. For example, Hillel, there was a fellow who wanted to convert to Judaism, and he said to Hillel, teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. And Hillel said, look, what bothers you, don't do to someone else. Sort of like flipping, love your neighbor as yourself. He expressed it in the negative. If something really, really irks you and bothers you, don't do it to your friend. And then Hillel says, and all of the Torah is a commentary to this. Everything is a commentary to this. He says, now go and study it. So no one would suggest that Hillel was only interested in the commandments dealing with our relationship with other people, and he was negating or rejecting the importance of observing the other commandments of the Torah. No, he was pointing to what he felt was the goal of all of the commandments, which is to make us into, healthier and better people. So I don't think that you could take this passage in Matthew 19 and say that Jesus was negating the importance of ritual commandments at all. We know that he himself wore tzitzit, for example.
Right.
I don't think that would be an argument that's makeable. And also, some Christians like to say that, the only commandments that are really ever binding are the 10 Commandments. That's what they speak about. The 10 Commandments, that's important. Nothing else is. But he included in here something that's not part of the 10 Commandments, where the Bible says in Leviticus, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself. That's not part of the 10 Commandments. And yet Jesus did include that. Now, what happens, interestingly, is that the young man says, well, I'm doing that, Jesus. I'm keeping all of these laws. So what am I missing, right? What else can I do? And Jesus says, if you want to be perfect. Now, what do you mean perfect? So the Talmud has an expression, it's called tzaddik gamur, perfectly righteous. So there are people who are a tzaddik, they're righteous, they're living a righteous life. But then there's a kind of person that's what they call a tzaddik gamur, perfectly righteous. And that's probably what Jesus was saying here. If you want to be perfectly righteous, he says, sell what you have and give it to the poor. And that will make you perfectly righteous. And then the story ends by the young man freaking out and saying, look, I got too much money to give away everything. This is actually problematic, because giving away everything that you have is certainly not seen as a wise thing to do in Jewish teaching, because then you make yourself into a welfare case and a poverty case, and you yourself become a burden on society. So the Talmud actually advises us not to give away more than 1/5 of our money. Jewish law requires we give 10% of our income to tzedakah, to charitable causes, but we shouldn't give more than 20%, because then we ourselves become impoverished, and then we're not good to anyone. So the idea of giving away everything would be a problem. Now, what's interesting is that here Jesus speaks about the ultimate virtue of giving everything away. We know later on, we see in the Gospels, that when this woman came to anoint him with very expensive oil, his own disciples are very bothered by that. They said, what is she doing? This is oil that you could have sold for a lot of money and given it to the poor. They almost seem to be upset that Jesus is allowing this to happen. What a waste of money. Just to pour this oil on you?
Wasn't that Judas that asked that, or?
that was one of the, I think at least Judas pointed this out.
Right.
And some people actually said this might have been the straw that broke the back for Judas and caused him to part with Jesus. He was so offended, by this incredible waste, because again, they had been hearing Jesus speaking about, helping the poor and taking care of the poor, and all of the ethical teachings of Jesus, including this one where he says, look, the ultimate is give away everything you have, right? Not just throw it away, but give it to the poor. And here they see this woman that's not just taking some little bit of cheap oil, she's taking a lot of expensive oil, and they point out, look, this is wasteful. There are a lot of poor people that could be eating from this. And Jesus basically says, look, the poor you'll always have. I'm not going to be here forever. Now, that doesn't seem to be a sentiment that lines up so neatly with this idea of the virtue of giving away what you have, especially when, if you go to Deuteronomy 15, it specifically says that because the poor will always be here, that's all the reason why you have to focus on giving to them. Meaning Jesus takes the idea that since there'll always be poor people around, you don't have to, don't sweat it. They'll be around tomorrow to give money to. And the Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah says exactly the opposite. It's precisely because there will always be poor people, make it a point of giving it to them now. Don't put it off. So this is I have said this before. I don't know how much of this Jesus said and how much of this is put into his mouth.
Right.
But the story that we're is a little bit distasteful. It's very difficult to square with Jewish teaching, Jewish ideology. I just want to finish off tonight just this last piece, beginning with verse 23. And this is interesting. Jesus says to his disciples, look, I want to say that it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. This is certainly, true, that one of the great tests in life is the test of not just poverty. That's a tremendously trying thing, but it's also a test of wealth. It's not easy to live a virtuous life sometimes when you're focused so much on your own wealth. People that are extremely wealthy often get caught up with it. The Talmud says someone that has 100 wants 200. And so it becomes sort of this rat race where you're constantly chasing after the money. There are some wealthy people who are not like that. We know, thank God, we see multi-billionaires now in the United States that have taken these pledges to give away, huge amounts of their money. So there you see wealthy people that are doing great things with their wealth. And that's to be applauded and supported. But certainly, to point out that being wealthy has its challenges is true. First of all, people that are wealthy have to always worry about their wealth. Will someone steal it? Talmud says, marbe nechasim, marbe daiga, that the more you have, the more you worry about it, because you begin to want to protect everything that you have. It becomes, again, a focus, almost an exclusive focus. It narrows people's lives, often in a very selfish way, self-centered way. So there is a challenge of wealth. It's interesting, by the way, that the Bible described the manna that fell in the desert as a test. God describes that he's testing the Jewish people. And there are two ways in which people have seen this test of the manna.
Right.
One, as a test from poverty, meaning they didn't have any food, meaning that they had to trust that every day God would send the manna down in the morning for them to gather. So there are people who looked at the test of the manna as a test, out of poverty, meaning we have nothing. And we have to always trust that tomorrow there's going to be food on the table. That's a test from poverty. But other people saw the exact same manna as a test from wealth, meaning that God gave them a guarantee, meaning that every single day, like the sun rises, there's going to be manna on the desert, and it's going to be enough for you. And so on some level, it's almost as if they had a guaranteed filled refrigerator every day. When you have that much, it's easy to get caught up with it, meaning that, you can just think about what you have and get into it and focus on it. It can take your focus away from spiritual things when you have, plenty, when you have enough. And so there are these two challenges in life: the challenge of poverty, the challenge of wealth. And Jesus appropriately, tells us that it's definitely challenging to be a wealthy person and to live a holy life. This expression, by the way, people often think that Jesus came up with almost every expression out of his mouth. Most of these are often very popular folk sayings from back then. So the Talmud actually speaks about not a camel going through the eye of a needle. In the Talmud, it's an elephant going through the eye of a needle, which might be even harder.
You think so?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that either would go through easily, but I think the elephant's a little bit wider than the camel.
Sure. Now, the concept that I heard, Rabbi, on that whole idea is that they're saying that the eye of the needle was actually the man gate door into a city. That was a nickname for that. The eye of the needle was supposedly for that. So meaning that, it's easier but not impossible. Camel can get through this man door, but he would have to basically crawl through because he's too tall and with the load, et cetera, et cetera. So the concept of it kind of matches that of the knot, where it says, in fact, the concept matches parallel. One argument is that it's not camel. That was mistranslation from the Aramaic, which is or from the Hebrew/Aramaic, where one says gamal for camel, and then gamal or something like that, which means a rope. So it changes the whole perspective, but it still has the same meaning. So it's easier for a rope to fit through the eye of a needle, which would make more sense. They were fishermen, sort of, but still not impossible. You would just have to do it one thread at a time. So it kind of carries the same weight.
Yeah, it was an expression back then, meaning that there was certainly an expression that was used about the elephant through the eye of the needle. Meaning it was an expression meaning impossible, not going to happen. So he's basically saying here that, he doesn't have much hope for someone who's wealthy. Just interestingly, by the way, the word gamal, camel, in Hebrew, gamal is the word in Hebrew also for kindness, for giving. So, in this whole passage about the importance of, giving what you have, the use of the camel rather than the elephant is significant.
Interesting. Because
he's been speaking about this idea of giving away and kindness to others. But I just wanted to make one final comment, which is that even though wealth is a challenge, and wealth can be something which really hurts people spiritually, it's not intrinsically bad. Meaning that the Bible often tells us that one of the ways God will bless us is with wealth. So it can't be something which is intrinsically evil if God sees wealth as a means of blessing us. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 28. We know in Psalm 112. This is a frequent way in which God showers his blessings upon us with physical wealth. And so it's not intrinsically evil. It's not something which has to be bad. It's something which basically has potential. Like anything in the world, every single thing in the world can be used in various ways. The challenge is to use it in a positive way. And so I would see the Bible, the Tanakh, taking a little bit of a different approach from Jesus. Jesus seems to say it's a foregone conclusion. It's basically not going to happen, he says. It's like getting a camel through the eye of a needle for a rich man to really be righteous. And the truth of the matter is we know many, many wealthy people who were incredibly righteous. So it's a bit of a pessimistic attitude. And, I think that if we had a talk show, we can get, a number of people to go on the talk show with Jesus and give him a hard time on this one.
Sure. And like you said, I mean, the whole idea of their approach and view was more from the Essenes anyway. So that would make sense that he is more pushing the envelope of the elephant idea being impossible rather than difficult.
Yeah, people did make that in the 1950s and 60s. That was a very common idea that Jesus, they say, was an Essene himself. and that his movement were a bunch of Essenes. I think that it's become a lot less popular over the last 20 years to make that identification. But the Essenes were more likely to live communally, so people didn't have private property. They gave away what they had. And so for those reasons, people did make the identification of Jesus's group with the Essenes. But I think that it's really hard to push that analogy too far. But it's clear that he seems to have a bit of a problem with wealth. So yeah, Tevye said in Fiddler on the Roof, "May the Lord strike me with it, and may I never recover."
That's one of my favorite movies, Rabbi.
But he wanted to do good stuff with his money, right? If he had money, what was he going to do? He was going to be able to sit and study all day with the wise men in the house of study.
Absolutely. Now, hey, same here, Lord. Bring it on. Ladies and gentlemen, find Rabbi Michael Skobac at www.jewsforjudaism.ca. Find him on Facebook also. And be sure to subscribe to this Facebook page and the website. You can also subscribe to Tanakh Talk on Facebook and the website as well. So until next time, Rabbi, thank you so much again. It was a great episode as usual, and we will see you later. Next week, everyone.
Shalom.
Shalom, shalom, shalom. Thank you.
Have an awesome August.
Yes, indeed.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.